after he was killed, I was sitting in Washington with Vladimir Kara-Murza in Congress, and we were again calling for the Magnitsky sanctions to be applied to the people who had promoted the killing of Boris Nemtsov. And shortly after that, Vladimir Kara-Murza, after being interviewed at a radio station, collapsed from severe poisoning, went into intensive care, went into a coma, went into multiple organ failure, and was literally within an inch of his life. And it's a miraculous miracle that Vladimir is actually sitting here today with us. It's truly a miracle. I thought for sure that So as Erwin said, we owe it to Boris, we owe it to Vladimir, and we owe it to Sergei Magnitsky for the Canadian government to pass the Magnitsky Act. And we're here now to speak to you tonight, and then the three of us, Jana,
in our country. He spoke about election fraud. He spoke about media censorship. He spoke about political prisoners and political repression. And he urged Canada, as a fellow member state of the OSCE, which upholds explicitly that human rights are not an internal affair, as Mr. Putin would like us to believe, but is a matter of international concern. He urged Canada to be open and frank and honest about those issues. In the 4 years that have passed since Boris Nemtsov came here, the situation in our country, in all of the areas he described, has become measurably worse. Elections in Putin's Russia continue to be a meaningless ritual used for confirming the incumbents, with the genuine opposition in most cases simply disqualified from the ballot. This happened, for instance, to my own party, the People's Freedom Party, in most jurisdictions where we sought to run in last September's regional elections. The voting process is accompanied by administrative intimidation and pervasive fraud. As many as 14 million votes were stolen in favor of Mr. Putin's party in the most recent parliamentary election in 2011. And the Kremlin is already beginning to prepare for this year's parliamentary election, which will be held on September the 18th. Just in the last 2 weeks, there have been new laws passed that target journalists and independent poll monitors who operate in polling stations. Of course, it was thanks to them that 4 years ago we saw the scale of the unprecedented fraud that brought hundreds of thousands of people to the streets of Moscow to protest after that election. Well, there are new laws now that say that press credentials will no longer be enough for journalists to get access to polling stations, and introduced, we call it serfdom for poll monitors. That is, at least 3 days before the election, each poll monitor will be assigned to a specific polling place and will not be able to change or to go to another one. In other words, the authorities 3 days before the election will know which polling places will be unprotected, will be without monitors, so they can do as they please, and free for all in terms of fraud and intimidation in those polling stations. All the television channels in our country for many years now have been under full Kremlin control and have been used as propaganda outlets by the regime to rail against the so-called external enemies, which is mostly Western countries and in the last 2 years, Ukraine, and against Mr. Putin's opponents inside Russia, against us, denounced as traitors, foreign agents, the fifth column, and all the rest of it. And political repression has reached unprecedented levels, or at least unprecedented since the late Soviet period. According to Memorial Human Rights Center, which is probably the most respected human rights organization in our country, there are currently 53 political prisoners in the Russian Federation. This is using the very complicated and high standard set by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe Resolution 1900 over who is to be considered a political prisoner. 53 people. They include opposition supporters jailed under the infamous Bolotnaya case. These are people who came out to the streets to protest Putin's inauguration in May 2012. They include, for instance, the brother of a prominent anti-corruption campaigner Alexei Navalny, Oleg Navalny, who's basically held as a hostage. They include Sergei Odaltsov, a leftist politician, Alexei Pichugin, the remaining hostage of the Yukos case. They include a colleague of mine from Solidarity Movement, Ildar Dadin, a Russian democracy activist, who was recently sentenced to 3 years in prison under a new law that targets people who participate in one-man street demonstrations. 3 years in prison for street picketing. And of course, they now include citizens of Ukraine, seized in Mr. Putin's ongoing aggression, of course, most famously, most infamously, I should say, Nadezhda Savchenko, the military pilot, who spoke today, in fact, in her trial in southern Russia, in the town of Donetsk. This is Russian town of Donetsk in the Rostov region. She had a closing statement today, very, very emotional, very strong closing statement, despite the fact that she's in ill health. She's been on hunger strike for some time, and some of the other Ukrainian citizens held as hostages too. So today in Russia we have manipulated elections, we have muzzled media, we have opposition protests and street rallies broken up, we have political opponents of the Kremlin in prison. This doesn't strike me as a behavior of a government that genuinely has 86 or whatever they say % they have in public support. It really does not. But of course, as we know from the reason for our forum today, intimidation, slander in state-run media, disqualification from the ballot, and even prison are no longer the biggest dangers that face those who dare to oppose Vladimir Putin's regime. 2 Saturdays ago was the 1-year anniversary of the day when Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov was gunned down with 5 bullets in the back, 200 yards away from the Kremlin wall, as he walked home over the Bolshoi Moskvoretsky Bridge. Now, it's difficult, it's impossible. I cannot talk about this objectively or standing back or describing, because Boris Nemtsov is a very close and very dear friend. And the sense of personal loss overshadows by far, any other possible considerations. But he was also the strongest, the most prominent, and the most effective leader of the democratic opposition in Russia today. He was the best among us. They didn't make a mistake in whom to take away. And he's irreplaceable. And I think the tens of thousands of people who marched through central Moscow 2 Saturdays ago in remembrance of him, and we walked from Pushkin Square down to Sakharov Avenue, and those of you who know Moscow, it's 2 sides of the Boulevard Ring, and they were all filled with people as far as the eye could see. There were about 30 or 40,000 people. And those people are testimony to the fact that he was irreplaceable. There's other people who continue every day for more than a year now to bring flowers and candles and pictures to the spot where he was murdered, on that bridge, by the Kremlin. Now, of course, the official reaction could not be more different. The Kremlin would like nothing better than to eradicate the memory of Boris, whom they have called, and these are the words of Mr. Putin's official spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, little more than an ordinary citizen. This is the quote. The Moscow authorities have refused to commemorate Boris Nemtsov in the Russian capital. They rejected the public petitions with tens of thousands of signatures calling for it. The Moscow municipal services continue to ravage the unofficial People's Memorial to him on the bridge. 5 times already since the beginning of this year they've done this. The investigators have refused to qualify his murder under Article 277 of the Russian Criminal Code, which is an attempt on the life of a public statesman. They've pointedly and repeatedly refused to do this. And although they have arrested the alleged perpetrators of the crime, the people who are supposed to have actually did this, and I do believe they do have the right people on that level, they have been unwilling or unable, or both, to rise above that level and to go to the organizers, and to go to the masterminds. And about 4 weeks ago, Alexander Bastrykin, who is the head of the Russian Investigative Committee, has announced that the assassination of Boris Nemtsov has been solved. If we are to believe the official version that they would like us to believe, the murder of the leader of the Russian opposition, 200 yards away from the Kremlin, in what is probably the most secure district, not just in Moscow, but in the whole of Europe, was masterminded by a driver. That is the official version. It's going to trial in a few weeks' time. So we do not believe that the official investigation in Russia is being conducted in good faith and free from political constraints. We therefore urge the international community, including our OSCE partners, including here in Canada, to initiate international oversight of this, to keep public attention on it, to not let the Kremlin swipe it under the carpet, as they would like to. And I think one of the most telling examples of this is that although there are obvious links between the alleged perpetrators who are under arrest And the Kremlin-appointed leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, for instance, the alleged gunman, was a serving officer in the Interior Ministry, Kadyrov Security Service, at the time of the assassination. He was not even formally questioned by the investigators, despite the requests by Zhang to do so, repeated requests. They were denied. And Mr. Kadyrov continues with impunity, and he continues to issue open and public threats against those who oppose Vladimir Putin. So, for instance, as he did a few weeks ago when he posted a video showing Mikhail Kasyanov, former Prime Minister of Russia, and myself, with superimposed crosshairs of a sniper rifle on his Instagram page. And the accompanying comment read, "Those who have not understood will." That was on February 1st. And I'll mention, because Marcus asked me to, although frankly speaking that is not my favorite subject for conversation, but I'm literally very fortunate to be here with you today, because as already mentioned, slipped into a coma last May in Moscow as a result of severe poisoning of unidentified origins, led to multiple organ failure. Still don't know what substance they used. The tests showed a very high concentration of several heavy metals, but we don't know what it was. And medical experts told my wife that the chances of survival are 5%. So I'm very happy to be here. It's only thanks to Almighty God and the doctors at the Pirogov Hospital in Moscow that I'm sitting here today. And I have no doubt, of course, that this was deliberate poisoning intended to kill, and was motivated by political activity. During that same visit here in Canada in February 2012, Boris Nemtsov not only spoke about the situation in Russia, but he also called on his Canadian interlocutors to do something. And that was to pass the Canadian version of the Magnitsky Law that Bill Browder just referenced, and other colleagues talked about earlier today. That law, passed in the United States in 2002, set a groundbreaking precedent by introducing for the first time personal accountability for human rights abuses. Personal, not against countries, not against even governments, but against the actual people responsible. And the people responsible for the arrest and torture and murder of Sergei Magnitsky and for other gross human rights abuses in Russia were to be denied visas and had their assets frozen by the United States government in the US case. And Boris Nemtsov called this law the most pro-Russian law ever passed in any foreign parliament. And he was absolutely right, because that law targets those who abuse the rights of Russian citizens and who plunder the resources of Russian taxpayers through enormous corruption. It's also a very honorable law, and it's also a very effective law, because we can talk about many differences between what exists in our country today and what happened in Soviet times. As we already mentioned, we have political prisoners, we have the lack of free and fair elections, we have propaganda and media censorship. But for all the similarities, there's also one very important difference. And that is that members of the Soviet Politburo, when they were stifling dissent and keeping dissidents in prison, they didn't keep their money in the West, they didn't educate their children in the West, they didn't buy real estate in yachts in the democratic West. People from the current regime, both officials and Kremlin-connected oligarchs, like to do that. I think this double standard has to be stopped. And I think that those who trample on the most basic norms of the civilized world should not be allowed to enjoy the privileges that the civilized world has to offer. So as Bill mentioned, we will be, all three of us, going to Ottawa to testify at hearings tomorrow and to meet with members of Parliament, to meet with representatives of the Canadian government and the official opposition, and we will call on them to finally end this impunity for crooks and abusers, and tell them that they're not welcome here, and tell them that you don't need their assets and their ill-gotten gains stored in Canadian banks. And we really hope that this Canadian Parliament, elected last year, will be the one to pass this legislation in honor of Sergei Magnitsky and in honor of Boris Nemtsov. And lastly, just want to recall that there was another conference here in Toronto also organized and co-hosted by Marcus, and co-hosted by some of the same organizations that are organizing this event today, the University of Toronto, the Central and Eastern Council of European Council of Canada, I believe. It was a Black Ribbon Day conference in August of 2010. And I see actually some friends who were there, and Boris, of course, was there. And Boris Nemtsov was the keynote speaker. He wasn't present here physically, but we had him by video link. He was in Jana's house, actually, and he was. We had the Skype link. And I remember, Marcus, you remember we had trouble with the Skype link. Every time he said the word FSB, the connection would be broken. But we did manage to have that in the end. And I just want to read something that he said in that speech to that Black Ribbon Day conference 5.5 years ago. He said, "Putinism is a disaster for our country. Putin is against freedom. He's afraid of the Russian people. He's afraid of rallies. He's afraid of the opposition. And he's afraid of elections. The Russian people are tired of Putin and his team, and they will ultimately change the system. But the real danger for the country is that there will be a bloody revolution." End of quote. I think the 5 years that have passed since he made those remarks only unfortunately made this scenario more likely. And the Kremlin likes to accuse us, members of the opposition, of being revolutionaries. And they created this new pro-Kremlin movement last year, pro-Putin thugs who parade the streets of Moscow, and they called it anti-Maidan. So they say we are the ones preparing a Maidan in Russia. Well, I think if anyone is preparing a Maidan in Russia, it's those people who have destroyed elections, who have eliminated and destroyed the democratic institutions, who have destroyed every single legal, constitutional, peaceful way for changing the government. And nothing is forever. And Mr. Putin is no exception. He's not forever too. But they are the ones who have ensured that when change does come to Russia, not if but when, it will come in some sort of a revolutionary scenario. So if somebody is looking for real revolutionaries in Russia today, I think they're to be found in the Kremlin. But I guess there's nothing new in that, because we saw exactly the same situation 100 years ago. So thank you once again very much. It's great to be here, and I look forward to our discussions and questions.
Good evening. First of all, my name is Жанна. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this event and for coming. There were lots of events in commemoration of my father all over the world, and I am very pleased that my father united people during his lifetime, but now he's dead, but he continues to unite people after his death. And there is a great opportunity for discussion, and if we still have a discussion on Russia, that means we still have hope that change will come to Russia. Secondly, I have listened to everybody, and I remembered the words of the host of CBC. We today, just a few hours ago, were interviewed with Vladimir Karamurza by CBC, and in his introductory statement he said, "Oh, let's look into the dark world of Russian politics." And yes, it's a really very dark world, unfortunately, of Russian politics. And I was asked by Marcus to speak about human rights, and I would like to say that I literally have no words. I cannot find any words to describe what's going on right now in Russia, because in the light of the case of Nadezhda Savchenko, my father's assassination, and a blocked investigation, and you, Vladimir, has already mentioned this. And to my deep regret, I have to admit that in Russia, human rights are not a value anymore, and the state does not respect human rights. And unfortunately, during the last days, the Russian state has once again showed to the whole world how cruel it is and how inhuman it is. I'm now talking about Nadezhda Savchenko case. And this is a very devastating thing for us, Russian citizens. And in this atmosphere, you unfortunately cannot dissociate, and you have to resist, though of course it's very difficult. I would like to say a few words about my personal experience, and I think that It's like Mr. Browder's experience a lot. I have never been a businessman in my life. I used to be a journalist in Russia, and I worked for RBC Television, which is like a Russian Bloomberg in a way. In a way, I covered financial news, financial markets, currencies, and world economy. I have never been actively involved in any political activities, though I was a very pro-democratic person. I was against the Crimean annexation and the war in Ukraine. But I thought that my father was the one to represent my interests and interests of my family, and that's why I thought that it would be too much to have two activists in one family. But when my father died, unfortunately the state of affairs in Russia is like that. I was forced to make a choice, and it was a very moral choice to call for justice and to find justice for my father, or to keep silence. And I have chosen to fight for justice for my father. That's why I'm taking an active part in the investigation process, though Vladimir is absolutely right that it is blocked, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to do anything. Because if you do not resist, the Russian state will become even more criminal. And now what we see with Mr. Kadyrov, he threatened the leaders of opposition, but he was given another chance by the Kremlin to be re-elected as the ruler of Chechnya. That means that criminal behavior is encouraged if you are loyal to Putin. And that's, of course, a very devastating state of affairs. And second thing I would like to mention is now we are now here discussing not corruption, but the right for life in Russia. Now corruption is the second most important issue, and the things are getting so worse that now even the fundamental right of people to live is under danger in Russia. I was also today interviewed by the Radio 1, CBS Radio 1, and my father was there in 2012, and there was a small recording played during my interview, and he was asked why he didn't want to leave Russia, and he put forward his arguments. But what I liked, I think that he had made a mistake not to leave Russia, but what I liked about his statement when he said, I don't want to leave Russia because I think that I'm right. And I think that he is right, and I think that many people after his assassination realized that my father was right, and that's why we are here today to pay tribute to my father. Thank you very much.
Of Ukraine before he was killed. Is that true? If so, will the information be presented to the public? That's the first question. And let me ask the second question. This is Sergei asks, also a question to Jana and or Vladimir. Imagine, I know it sounds unrealistic right now, that you are a member of the political opposition, are miraculously elected to Russian parliament, and are able to solve the Crimean problem. What will be your immediate moves? What will be your solution? In other words, if I can paraphrase, what is the solution now to the Crimean problem that the opposition, might have in mind?
So the first question, yes, my father just shortly before his assassination, he was working on a report which was called Putin War. But it was released after his death, and he got some evidence of the involvement of the Russian regular troops into the conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine. But he was not the first to reveal these facts, because before lots of some media outlets published some reports on this, and also Lev Schlossberg, for example, they they're a member of the regional government of Pskovska region, published a report about paratroopers who presumably died in the eastern part of Ukraine. So my father was not the first one. That's why I believe that his assassination was politically motivated, but not because he was working on the report, but because of his general political activities. He was killed. And the second question, I will have a very short answer. I don't want to be a politician. I don't want to run for the State Duma. I don't want to go to the Russian government. I want to be a journalist. And I hope that one day I can be a journalist in Russia. And I hope that Vladimir Kremlza will be in the government or in the State Duma resolving the Crimea problem. And the only thing I would like to say that I was from the first day against the annexation of Crimea, as all sober-minded people were in Russia.
So she's saying I have to answer that question. But on that, so Jean answered about the first one already, and it was actually just a few days before Boris was assassinated that he was, people from the city of Ivanovo reached out to him, the families of paratroopers who were sent to Ukraine and killed there. And this is how the idea came to him of publishing this report, because he always believed in enlightenment and in trying to break through that wall of lies and propaganda. And he published many such reports before on corruption, on the state of Russia's communal systems, for instance, on the Sochi Olympics, his probably most famous report back in 2013, and so on. So he did work on that report because it's also important to understand that if you watch Russian TV, all the propaganda channels, there is no war against Ukraine. There is no Russian military involvement in Ukraine. There are no weapons. There are no servicemen sent there and killed there. None of this exists. And there is a reason for this, because even with everything we said about opinion polls, and even with the state of public opinion and the propaganda, one opinion poll after another, even conducted by government agencies, shows a clear majority of the Russian people categorically against any military action against Ukraine. So they're trying to pretend, the Kremlin is trying to pretend it's not happening. And so any such breach through this wall of lies and propaganda is great damage to them. On your second question, the million-dollar question about Crimea, there are several ideas currently being discussed within the Russian opposition about how to deal with this. And you're absolutely right, and Andriy is absolutely right to raise this question, because we have to think about it now. When things collapse and when we have to start working on it, it'll be too late to think and to discuss. So there are various proposals. When we were in Strasbourg a few weeks ago, and Bill was there too, and I was there with Mikhail Kasyanov, the former Russian Prime Minister. He met with Mustafa Dzhemilov, who is the leader of the Crimean Tatars, who's a member of the Ukrainian Parliament, he's a member of the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. So they had a meeting, and Mr. Kasyanov told him that the only thing to do here is to annul the legal decision and to give Crimea back. There is another position which is held by Yabloko Party, which is another liberal opposition party in Russia, which suggests holding a real referendum under international supervision, not a second referendum, because nobody thinks what happened 2 years ago was a referendum. It wasn't. It was a sham. So they propose holding another referendum with the agreement of the government of Ukraine and with European monitoring to see, to determine how people actually vote, as opposed to when they vote under foreign tanks. No, they want to do it in Crimea, but with obviously with the agreement of the government of Ukraine, because that's the only way you can do it legally. So there are various proposals going around, but I think the most important thing, and this is shared throughout the democratic opposition in Russia, is a recognition that what happened 2 years ago was illegal, was unacceptable, was in violation of Russia's clearly stated international obligations under both the Budapest Memorandum and the Russian-Ukrainian Friendship Agreement of 1997, and that this problem has to be solved. Because if we don't recognize that, then there is no way moving forward, and I think every single responsible democratic opposition leader and organization in today's Russia recognizes this.
Bill, you didn't want to get in on that one.
I'm happy to say that they should give it back right away in the story.
Okay, let me group together two questions. If we still have time, I'm looking over at Marcus. Two more questions. Okay, let's see how far this takes us. Obviously, I've got a large stack here. It's a bit much to handle. Great questions here. I will say, though I won't ask these questions, there are a series of questions that essentially are expressions of admiration for all three of you, for the work that you've done, for the commitment that you've made, and for the hardships that you've experienced. So I think it's worth remembering. You know, we sometimes forget at a university that it's not all abstractions and theories. There are real people and who experience real things. So I won't ask you those questions right now. Let's return to the international scene, because I think that that's a theme here. What can be done internationally? Now, group two together here, one on the Canadian side and one on the EU side. And so the question about Canada is, do you think, and I'm not sure if the expertise is here on the panel per se, but do you think that Canada's strong extractive sector, there might be strong lobby against Magnitsky legislation? That's on the Canadian side. And then a question from Matti Prima, who asks, as EU countries have monopsonistic control, that means one buyer control over Russian oil, right? Where it's Russian oil that supplies, it's Russian gas in particular. What can be done to get European governments to look for alternative sources of energy is the question, and of course the implied question is to exercise influence as need be.